Should they stay or should they go? As foreign terror suspects are rounded up, we ask who's responsible for them. Is it the country they're from or where they committed their crimes? I'm Imran Gata, and today's Newsmaker is Turkey's plan to deport members of Daesh. This week, Turkey announced the capture of the sister of slain Daesh leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Now Ankara says it's arrested his wife too. But the government has warned it doesn't want the country to become a hotel for terror suspects and has announced plans to send foreign fighters back home. The problem is, many of those countries, like Belgium, Germany and the UK, don't want them back. Britain has gone so far as to strip some suspected terrorists of their citizenship, essentially washing their hands of their own people and making them the burden of another country's judicial system. It's a practice Turkey calls unacceptable and irresponsible, and one that effectively leaves thousands of men and women in legal limbo. And what will happen to the families of suspected Daesh members, especially the children? Adam Pletz takes a look.
As many as 10,000 suspected Daesh members are imprisoned in Syria, Iraq and Turkey. The Turkish government alone says it's holding 1,200 terrorists and their family members. Most of them are from foreign countries, with a large number from Europe, whom Turkey says it will deport.
This new method where they say, we took his nationality away, now it's your problem, that's unacceptable in our view. That's totally irresponsible. Let's be clear. What do you want me to do with your terrorist?
Human rights organizations say revoking the citizenship of Daesh members is illegal.
Our message to all states who have citizens in those camps to take responsibility, to be courageous, because we know it's a major political and security challenge. We're totally aware of this. But I still believe that if you look at all the population in this camp, the situation of the Westerners is probably the easiest one to solve.
US President Donald Trump has called on EU nations to take back their Daesh nationals. But many EU states, including the UK and Belgium, insist suspects be prosecuted where their crimes took place. Tensions between Turkey and the EU came to a head during Turkey's Peace Spring military operation.
Ey Avrupa Birliği! Kendinize gelin. Bak yine söylüyorum. Bizim şu andaki operasyonumuzu bir işgal hareketi diye nitelendirmeye çalışırsanız işimiz kolay. Kapıları açarız. 3,6 milyon mülteciyi sizlere göndeririz.
EU states are reliant on cooperation with Turkey to curb the number of refugees reaching Europe.
Turkey must understand that our main concern is that their actions may lead to another humanitarian catastrophe, which would be unacceptable. Nor will we ever accept that refugees are weaponized and used to blackmail us.
Ankara considers it hypocritical that European nations expect Turkey to host millions of Syrian refugees, but will not accept the return of their own citizens who are suspected terrorists. With Turkey, the US and human rights organizations calling for countries to take back their Daesh fighters, should foreign governments reconsider their policy towards them? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
To look at some of what those policies entail, let's go to our guest in Ankara. I'm joined by Ömer Özkızılcık. He's an analyst at the Security Department of the SETA Foundation and the editor of a web portal focusing on Syria. And in London is Andre Walker, a correspondent and columnist for the New York Observer. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Ömer, so Turkey is saying take them back to their home countries. The Europeans, well, especially the Europeans, are saying this is none of our business. Is that something that has some merit because the Europeans have had some experience with this and they feel they don't want to get burnt? They don't want anything to do with it right now.
So actually, the current situation is a nightmare knocking on the doors of the European Union, because they have initially attempted to export their homemade radicals, homemade jihadis to Syria in the hope that they will get off of them and they will go to Syria and die there, and so they will not have this issue anymore. Because these people who went to Syria to fight alongside the ISIS terrorist organization, they have been socialized in the European Union states, so most of them are native people of their home countries, and some others are former migrants who have been educated, socialized in their country. So the radicalization issue of some Muslim groups inside the European states is a homemade issue, and it has to do a lot with the society, with democracy in these countries, and also with Islamophobia. So they have firstly accepted and even not prevented suspects from going to Syria, despite knowing and despite having almost all of them in their list. However, it came otherwise. In contrast to the hopes that they will go to Syria and die, the people have made children, they are now battle-hardened, and they survived. But they are now in the hands of the Turkish government, of the Iraqi government, and in the hands of non-state armed actors in Syria. So it's a nightmare for them, because the European states know if the terrorists came back to their home countries via a legal procedure, they don't have the necessary laws to have real sentence against these terrorists, and they will go out of the prisons in only a matter of time, and they have a lack of proofs against these terrorists. So therefore, they fear that these terrorists, if they come back, will go into the society again and will cause national security threat for the European states.
And good news, David Otto also joins us now from London. He's the Director for Counterterrorism at Global Risk International UK. David, to that point, they talk of so-called recidivism, right? This idea that people will come back, they won't face justice, and they'll slip back into society, say, for example, in a place like Belgium, and they'll only end up doing harm to fellow citizens. Is that a real fear? Is that a justifiable and justified fear?
I don't think the recidivism rate, has to be determined by the radicalization levels, but also by the level of de-radicalization programs that these individuals go through. You've got to do a very in-depth assessment of these individuals to ensure that you understand their level of radicalization. Before you can talk about the recidivism rate. A lot of the countries are simply just concerned, because, they don't have, the required, so to speak, systems, of rehabilitation and reintegration in place. I mean, but you would expect, countries like Belgium, like the United Kingdom, with the structural capacity that they have, not to say that we don't want to get them in because we are worried about the level of recidivism. I think each country, as the previous speaker said, needs to take their responsibility. They need to make sure that these individuals who they failed to prevent from leaving their home countries and travel to areas in Syria, they shouldn't be abandoned in the hands of Turkey or in the hands of Iraq or Syrians. Governments must take their responsibility. We cannot behave in a barbaric manner, because, it just brings us to the level of thinking and acting like terrorists themselves.
Okay, let's bring in Andre Walker here. Andre Walker, the point being made by both previous guests is that countries need to take responsibility. This is a collective problem. No one country is responsible for this issue. It became a global issue, and whether it's connected to somebody who is going to be rehabilitated or somebody who's going to be punished and face justice, ultimately it needs to happen in their home country. Do you accept that?
Well, I think the first speaker said some things that were true and some things that were untrue. I think what he said that was true was that the Western system, particularly the European countries, have no real capacity in terms of the law to deal with whatever criminal offence have taken place. Now, clearly, they do have the money and the resources to put people in prison for long sentences. But the fact is, many of these guys aren't guilty of a great deal when you come to the United Kingdom or indeed Belgium. Where he was wrong and where I think what he said was untrue was the idea that the Western countries have deliberately exported this problem to the Middle East. I think there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Britain had wanted jihadis to go over and terrorise people in Iraq and Syria. But one point that I would make, which I think is a potential solution to all this, both Iraq and Syria have the death penalty for terror offences, and I think that what we need to do is support prosecutors within those countries in seeking the death penalty for those people for whom it is appropriate.
But Andre, you trust Bashar al-Assad's judicial system to deal with Daesh suspects?
Well, look, it wasn't me that went to Syria and began killing people. I think if you go to a country and you move to that country illegally and begin terrorising that country illegally, then unfortunately you have to suffer the judicial system of that country.
Okay.
Whether you have faith in the judicial system, hey, look, there's a reason why I've never gone to Syria. The reason I've never gone to Syria is because I don't trust the judicial system.
Is that the only reason you haven't gone to Syria?
They have to face the consequences.
Okay, I'm hoping that's not the only reason you didn't go to Syria, Andre. But the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, prohibits...
With what this...
Yep, this is interesting. It prohibits any state party from transferring its nationals to a country where they are at risk of being sentenced to death. So there's also, you know, this collection of rules
yes.
and things that people have, or countries have signed up to, that get contravened if you allow people to face justice in a place like Iraq or Syria.
But this is a unique set of circumstances where a group of terrorists illegally set up a country and began terrorising local residents, executing people in the streets, ripping their heads off aid workers. Look,
let me take an exceptional circumstance within the exceptional circumstance. Andre, what about, say, a 7-year-old kid? What do you do with that 7-year-old kid? Leave them to the mercy of Assad?
Well, I'll tell you what I would have done in the case of Shamima Begum, who was very concerned, the British national, who was deeply concerned about her child dying in a refugee camp. What I would have said was the British government has the responsibility to look after the child, but not Shamima Begum. And I would have happily sent in the military to collect the child, but I'm afraid Mum is going to have to fend for herself. She has chosen to be a terrorist. We've got to be very robust on this. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you why.
Please.
We failed collectively to stop people coming from Europe to terrorise people in the Middle East, in places like Turkey, in places like Syria and in places like Iraq. We need to now be incredibly strong to ensure this never happens again. And if that means the death penalty, and if that means leaving people permanently in refugee camps, we need to be caring enough about the people in the Middle East to do that.
David Otto, I know you disagree with a bunch of things there. Have a bite.
I think I do disagree. You know, one thing that we must not advocate, you know, is the glorification of, you know, this kind of death penalty and ruthless decisions. You know, stripping of nationalities and abandoning citizens. Of course, most of these young people, you know, somehow, you know, made the decision to travel to these countries, to Syria and Iraq, to be involved in terrorism. But it still doesn't, you know, warrant, you know, this kind of reactions, you know, from the UK government or from any European state. I think each government has to take upon its responsibility and bring back, you know, its citizens, you know, and ensure that these citizens, if they are found to have committed offences, they should go through the criminal justice system. The UK has it. Most European states have the systems in place. Again, we must not think like terrorists. We must always, you know, show humanity where others, you know, are showing barbarism. You know, I think this is the best way forward. This is the solution. The solution is to bring back these citizens and put them through the criminal justice system. You know, this is what is going to drive people that want to join terrorist organizations to see that there is a way out. You know, we are not winning the war, you know, of hearts and minds by carrying out the same kind of tactics that terrorists are carrying out. So I think it is more important for British governments, to look into this, much more detailedly.
Ömer Özkazılcık, now there have been countries such as Kazakhstan, Kosovo and others, they've taken a lot of their own citizens back, those who were Daesh suspects, right? But 2019 is an interesting year, and there's an interesting fever in the atmosphere. The zeitgeist is unique, especially within countries that belong to the European Union. A lot of these countries, the leaders in these countries are accountable to voters who don't want anything to do with Daesh suspects, whether these people have passports from that country or not. That's democracy, right? And that's a part of it as well. So these countries can turn back and say, listen, Omar, nice theory, but my voters don't want us to deal with these people coming back. They'd rather they just rot in Iraq and Syria because they don't want to get involved in the Middle East problems. Isn't that reasonable?
So actually, it's quite funny to hear that the Europeans are speaking about death penalty, because when the coup attempt in Turkey happened and some in the civil society discussed death penalty, then the European Union went crazy and threatened Turkey with the end of the candidate process to the European Union if Turkey would impose death penalty in Turkey. But now the same Europeans are demanding death penalty for their ISIS homemade terrorists in Syria and in Iraq.
Speak for the
this
European
is quite
Union.
funny to me. And secondly,
not even close.
Yes. It's even funny to hear that even some are speaking. And here I have to underline that the democracy is not only about popular vote. Popular vote is an essential part of democracy, but it's also about justice, it's about human rights, it's about law enforcement. And here I'm quite surprised that the European Union will not take the responsibility, but we have to accept that the European Union has deliberately allowed their homemade terrorists to go to Syria. Most of these terrorists were listed suspects. They were known to the intelligence in the European states. In Germany, almost an important part of the Salafi jihadis, known suspects, went to Syria. Turkey has deported 6,000 ISIS terrorists who went to Turkey to cross to Syria before they crossed into Syria. And some of them were deported twice because they came back again and they were not being arrested in their home countries. So it was a deliberate act, and now they don't want to take responsibility at all. And this is also, we have to see it in line with the process. The European Union has been given the burden of 3.6 million refugees to Turkey. They won't help Turkey to host these refugees inside Turkey. They are doing nothing but giving obstacles for the return of Syrian refugees to the Turkish safe zone. And this is the same. The European Union is not ready to take responsibility, but wants to hand it over.
It's seen on a parallel. Yeah, come in, Andre.
Look, what we've heard twice now is effectively a crazed conspiracy theory. What you need to understand is there is a big difference between Europeans showing up in the Middle East and European governments deliberately enabling them or encouraging them to go to the Middle East. It is true to say that there's been a significant failure by European countries, including my own, to deal with this problem.
And everybody
but the suggestion that there has been a deliberate, the suggestion that there has been a deliberate policy by European countries to send these people is an unfair criticism, and I'll tell you why. Because it suggests that we have deliberately presided over. Deliberately, hang on, deliberately. It suggests that we have deliberately. It suggests we have deliberately.
They know the guy who was paid by the German intelligence.
We have deliberately presided over a situation. It suggests that we have deliberately presided over a situation. Am I allowed to answer this comment? It suggests that we have deliberately. Hang on one second. I just want to make this point. It suggests that Europeans have deliberately created a situation in which people in the Middle East are being bullied by European citizens. It is not true that it's deliberate.
Okay. We'll have a separate discussion about how countries dropped the ball or whether they turned a blind eye to people going to Raqqa and so on. We will do that soon. David Otto, very finely, very briefly, please. The fact that Daesh or ISIS was so cosmopolitan, they came from so many different places, is a part of this headache. Very finely, David, and in less than 20 seconds, are they still capable of regenerating especially ideologically, because they're not wedded to any one country or any one particular ethnicity?
Of course, Daesh, the ideology of Daesh has in no way, been reduced. I mean, of course, the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi may have, caused, commotion, but that hasn't done anything to degrade, or affect, Daesh ideology. I mean, if you look at what is happening in Syria, in some areas where Daesh still has pockets, of sleeper cells. They still have pockets of sleeper cells, even within Afghanistan. Daesh is very strong in Central Africa and West Africa, where I've just been. The ideology is still very much high in the Sahel region. They are still recruiting. So I don't think, the ideology of Daesh has actually been touched. And I think that is where, the focus should be. And I do agree with the gentleman that there wasn't any deliberate policy by the Europeans to allow their citizens. But, there were systematic failures that, allowed for citizens to travel to these countries, because the idea at the time, or the belief, was that it was a one-way ticket. But of course, it isn't a one-way ticket. There is always a blowback. Okay. But I think, again, we have to take responsibility and ensure that we deal with Daesh ideology, and, not just focus on the military side of it.
Gentlemen, I've got to wrap and I have to move on. Love to have you back on the program soon. Omar, David, and Andre, thanks so much for joining us. This year, we spoke to Human Rights Watch's director for Israel and Palestine, Omar Shakir. He was accused of promoting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, better known as BDS. And as a result, Israel wanted to expel him from the country. We said we'll follow the story closely, and on Tuesday, the country's top court decided to uphold the order for his deportation. Shakir now has a little over 2 weeks to leave the country. Well, let's speak now to the man at the center of the story, Omar Shakir, who joins me from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Omar, are you disappointed? You were hopeful that the Supreme Court would back you. How disappointed are you, I guess?
I'm certainly disappointed, not only because it'll mean that I likely will have to leave the place that's been my home for 2.5 years and not be able to continue doing my job with Israeli and Palestinian partners engaged in the important work of protecting human rights in the context of a 52-year occupation defined by systematic rights abuse, but because of what it means. The Supreme Court has essentially put its stamp on the Netanyahu government's systematic crackdown on human rights advocacy. And this sends a chilling message to other rights advocates. The Israeli government has been saying, and now the Supreme Court has endorsed, a view that says that free speech in Israel does not include the most rudimentary forms of advocacy for Palestinian rights. And that is a message that threatens to not only limit the space for human rights advocates, but really for criticism of any form against the Israeli government.
As we've noted on the show before, as we've experienced on the show before when you've been a part of panels, Hamas says you're biased. The Israelis say you're biased. What did that tell you about, I guess, the nature of the current situation in Israel and the occupied territories?
And the Palestinian Authority missed as well.
Oh, yes, of course.
I used to cover,
they also said you're biased.
And I used to cover Egypt for Human Rights Watch, and during the Morsi government, we were, anti-brotherhood. During the Sisi government, we're pro-brotherhood. We're pro-Saudi, pro-Qatar. I mean, the easiest way to deal with serious human rights abuses when you've lost the argument is to attack the messenger. It is the playbook 101 of authoritarian governments. And it's unfortunate that the Israeli government, instead of dealing with its serious rights record, has resorted to deporting the messenger, to the credit, I think, of the Palestinian Authority. Despite our hard-hitting reports on systematic arbitrary arrests and torture, our call for the International Criminal Court to consider those allegations, I've continued to be able to meet them and engage with them. And we've had a door to do the same thing with the de facto Hamas authorities in Gaza, but it's been the Israeli government who hasn't allowed us in. I think the goal here is quite simple. It is not only to muzzle Human Rights Watch, but it's actually to isolate Palestinian human rights victims, from access to international human rights groups. They have blocked access to UN special rapporteurs. There's a number of other measures that have been taken against international rights advocates. It's all part of the same collection of repressive policies.
They say you support BDS. Do you support BDS?
Neither Human Rights Watch nor I, as its representative, promote boycotts of Israel. It's that simple. We've never called for a boycott of Israel, a consumer boycott of companies, even companies that do business in settlements. What we do around the world as part of our universal work is we call on companies to respect human rights, as they're obligated to do under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And years of research has led us to conclude that if you're operating in illegal settlements, you're invariably contributing to rights abuse. So we've called on companies like Airbnb to stop doing business in settlements and to respect rights. But that call is distinct from saying boycott Airbnb, much less boycott Israel proper. We're telling a company, like we tell a state, to respect human rights. The fact that the government is throwing out Human Rights Watch for telling companies to respect rights should lead to the question of who will it throw out next.
Right. I've got to wrap the live show. Omar Shakir, pleasure talking to you once again here on the Newsmakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.